Before getting into today's stories, let me know where everyone is from and what time so we can send wishes of health and luck to you and your relatives and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of our channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's get started. Story 1. The paranormal has never been something I put much stock in, but today's train ride home has left me questioning. I commute daily on the Metro Union Pacific North Line from downtown Chicago, usually taking the 521 train to my stop at Rogers Park. It's a routine I know well, a predictable slice of life until today. The Metro trains have a distinct layout, a middle vestibule with heavy sliding doors leading to either the front or rear halves of the car. Above the main level, stairs lead to a row of solo seats on the upper level. Today, as usual, I boarded the third car from the front and found a window seat on the left side, about 5 or 6 rows up from the vestibule. It was just another commute. At our first stop, Ravenswood, the train emptied out significantly. A woman who had been sitting next to me left, and soon after, a man in his late 50s filled her spot. He wore a gray business suit with a tie and jacket, his presence as unremarkable as his attire, except for one detail, his briefcase. The leather was worn and cracked, its vintage quality striking. It looked like something pulled from another era, perhaps an antique store or a long-forgotten attic. That's an old piece, I thought to myself, but kept quiet. I was getting off at the next stop, so I leaned over slightly, gesturing to my pass. I'm getting off at the next stop. Do you want to swap seats? It's common courtesy on the Metro, something I've never had anyone refuse. Without looking at me, he muttered in a sharp, almost dismissive tone, "No, I don't." The response caught me off guard. I turned back to my book, thinking, "Fine, suit yourself, guy." "It's been a long day," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was gravelly, almost tired. "This train, it's always the same, isn't it? Same stops, same faces. Gets predictable." I glanced at him, surprised by the shift in tone. "I guess it can be," I replied cautiously. "But there's a comfort in that, knowing what to expect." He let out a low chuckle, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Predictability can be deceiving. Makes it easier to miss what's really there." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued despite myself. He shrugged, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint smile. "Sometimes people see only what they want to see. Trains are like that. People come and go. Faces blur together. And before you know it, you've forgotten who sat next to you yesterday. The day before that."
I nodded slowly, his words oddly unsettling. I guess that's true, but some things do stand out. My eyes flicked to his briefcase.
The cracked leather catching the dim overhead light. "Ah, this old thing," he said, following my gaze. "It's been with me a long time. Seen places, carried secrets. Funny how objects hold on to pieces of us." The way he said it made my skin prickle, but I forced a smile. "I suppose they do." Minutes later, as the train slowed for Rogers Park, I reached for my pass and slid it back into my wallet. The man beside me stood abruptly. Turning toward the vestibule, I followed suit, standing up and stepping into the aisle. I expected to see him a few rows ahead, waiting for the doors to open. But he wasn't there. Confused, I looked toward the vestibule. The sliding doors were closed, which struck me as odd. These doors, heavy and slow, take time to open and close. If he had gone through, I would have seen them in motion. Besides, there were 2 people standing in the aisle between me and the vestibule, and neither had moved aside for anyone. My thoughts raced. Maybe he went up to the solo seats above. It seemed plausible. I craned my neck to glance at the upper level. The rows were mostly empty, cleared out from the Ravenswood stop. He wasn't there. By now, I was beginning to feel unsettled. The 2 people in front of me shuffled forward as the train came to a stop, allowing me to step closer to the vestibule. I peered through the glass doors, scanning the small area beyond. It was packed with people, their bodies pressed together as they waited for the outer doors to open. He wasn't among them. The train doors slid open at Rogers Park, and the crowd poured onto the platform. I stepped out, my eyes darting around, scanning faces and movements. He wasn't there. No gray suit. No worn briefcase. I stood on the platform, a chill creeping over me despite the warmth of the late afternoon sun. I retraced every moment in my mind, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Had he moved to another car? But the crowd, the closed doors, and the layout of the train made that impossible. Had I encountered a phantom? The question hung in my mind, unwanted but persistent. Rational explanations seemed to dissolve with every replay of the events. As I walked away from the station, I couldn't shake the image of his briefcase, its cracked leather and antique quality now feeling far more sinister than intriguing. Story 2. It was supposed to be just a simple day trip. My buddy and I were on a training course in a remote area of Africa. After a few days of lectures, we decided to break free for a while, escape the monotony of the lectures. We figured we'd hit the city for some sightseeing, maybe grab a few drinks at a bar, and end the night at a strip club. It wasn't the smartest decision, but what did we know? We were two big, bold guys. The locals had warned us about taking the train. It was known to be dangerous for foreigners, especially at night. But we were stubborn. We had no other real option to get back to our base, and the thought of driving those long, winding roads in the middle of nowhere didn't sound much better. We boarded the train around 10 p.m., tired but excited. The carriage was practically empty, just a few scattered seats here and there, and the usual train hum in the background. My buddy and I slouched into our seats, cracked open some drinks we'd smuggled in, and tried to relax. But as the train picked up speed, the evening began to feel off. The air inside the carriage grew stale, the kind of damp air that clung to your skin. About 30 minutes into the ride, we heard it, the screech of the train's brakes. A door slid open with a groan, and a group of 5 or 6 men stepped in. Their movements were deliberate, like they were calculating something, sizing up the room, looking for targets. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their eyes narrowed, their expressions unreadable. They had the aura of trouble. They wandered up and down the aisles, taking their time, but they didn't speak to anyone, not until they stopped in front of us. The tallest man of the group, broad-shouldered and with a face like chiseled stone, locked eyes with me. There was something unsettling about the way he stared. It wasn't just a glance. No, it was as if he was studying me, sizing me up like I was some kind of prey. Then, with a deliberate motion, he reached into his waistband and pulled out a knife. It wasn't anything flashy, just a short, crude blade, the kind that looked like it had been sharpened in haste. But in that moment, the blade didn't matter. It was the man's eyes that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something wrong about him, something dangerous, something primal. The train swayed, the noise of the wheels against the tracks filling the air, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. My buddy, who had been chatting about nothing in particular, went quiet. He must have sensed it too. We were trapped on a moving train in the middle of nowhere, with no way to escape, and these men had taken an interest in us. I could feel the panic creeping in. Every instinct told me to be ready, to act fast. But I didn't know what to do, so I did what came naturally. I tried to keep the situation under control. I smiled, trying to remain calm, and nodded toward the man's knife. "Hey brother, looks like you've got a nice knife there. What's it for?" He looked at me, eyes narrowing. The tension in the air was palpable. He was silent for a moment, probably trying to figure out if I was being serious or mocking him. Then, slowly, he pulled the knife out and waved it in the air. "Ah, this," he stammered. "This is for cutting bread." As Cernikitin, I raised an eyebrow. There was no way he believed that. "Oh yeah, I've got a knife too," I said, pulling out my folding pocket knife. "I use mine for buttering my bread." I showed it to him with a smile, hoping the awkwardness would put him off. But instead, his eyes lit up. He reached out, and before I could even register what was happening, he was sitting next to me. I could smell the sweat on him, the faint scent of alcohol and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, but it made my stomach churn. "Nice knife," he muttered, admiring the blade in my hand. "Can I see it?" he asked, his tone almost eager. I nodded slowly, still trying to keep the situation light. I handed him my knife, and in return, he handed me his, a wooden-handled blade, its point jagged and crude. It looked more like a weapon than a tool. The exchange was awkward. Neither of us wanted to let go of the other's knife, both of us knowing that if we did, the other could turn on us in an instant. We sat there passing the knives back and forth, the conversation odd and strained. The train rattled and creaked, the swaying motion making me feel like I was losing control. My mind raced. Was this a robbery? Was he trying to distract me long enough to pickpocket me? Or was there something worse happening here? Something I couldn't see? The men around us were still silent, watching us, like they were waiting for something. The air felt thick, too thick, and every second stretched on like an eternity. I looked around the train, and for the first time, I noticed how dark it was. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, more twisted. There was no one else on board, no passengers, just us and the looming figures of these strangers. Then just as quickly as they had arrived, the men stood up. They left the carriage at the next stop, not saying a word, just silently walking out of the door. The train doors closed with a heavy thud, and the moment was over. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. The train resumed its rhythm, the quiet hum of the wheels against the tracks settling me slightly. But then I reached into my pocket. My phone was gone. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. That bastard had used the distraction of the knife to pickpocket me. My mind was racing. I hadn't felt a thing. Not a thing. How? How had I been so blind to it? I had been so focused on the knives, on the danger in the air, that I didn't even notice when he took it. I glanced over at my buddy whose face had gone pale. His hands were empty. His phone had been taken too. And suddenly it hit me. It wasn't just the phone that was missing. It was the feeling of safety, the feeling that we were in control, that we were somehow untouchable. We were in the middle of nowhere, isolated, and now we were both exposed. I looked out the window. The night had grown darker, the landscape blurring by in the dim light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had been too naive, too sure of myself. Those men hadn't been just thugs looking for a quick score. No, they had been something else, something darker, something that had been waiting for us to make a mistake. And then it hit me. What if they weren't just after our phones? What if they had been watching us all along, waiting for the right moment to strike? What if the train wasn't just taking us to the next station? What if it was taking us somewhere else, somewhere we weren't supposed to be? The train kept rattling along, but it felt like it was going too fast now. The hum of the engine, the flicker of the lights, the shadows, everything felt wrong. The further we went, the more I felt like we were heading into a place that no one ever came back from. By the time we reached our destination, I was no longer sure if we had made it out unscathed. My phone was gone, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that the night wasn't over, that something darker was still lurking just out of sight. As we left the train and stepped onto the platform, the silence of the night settled around us. My buddy looked over at me, but his eyes weren't the same anymore. We both knew we hadn't escaped. The question wasn't if we'd been robbed. The question was whether we were ever truly safe. And in that moment, I realized we might never really know. We walked away, but the unease never left. And neither did the feeling that something was still watching, waiting for the right time to make its move. Story 3. A couple of years ago, I was backpacking solo through France. At the time, I was a 21-year-old woman, excited and a little nervous about traveling on my own. One of my stops was the famous Versailles, a day trip I'd taken from Paris. To get there and back, you need to take 2 separate trains, which felt straightforward enough until it wasn't. After a long day exploring the sprawling gardens and ornate halls of Versailles, I caught the first train heading back to Paris. My phone was at a precarious 3% battery, so I had switched it to airplane mode and low power, hoping to conserve just enough to navigate back to my hostel if needed. To discourage any unwanted attention, I put in my headphones, even though nothing was playing. That's when John showed up. I didn't know his name, of course, but he came over and sat beside me, speaking to me in rapid French. I wasn't in the mood for conversation, especially with a stranger, so I pretended not to understand the language, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. John pulled out his phone, opened Google Translate, and typed, "Do you want to learn French?" He held the screen up for me to read, his expression expectant. "No, thank you," I replied curtly, trying to sound as disinterested as possible. I turned my body slightly away from him, making it clear I wasn't interested in talking. He didn't take the hint. Instead, he kept typing. The next message read, "Where are you sleeping?" My stomach dropped. "With my family at a big hotel in Paris," I lied, hoping it would dissuade him. He typed again. "Where in Paris?" I hesitated. "Just Paris," I said, keeping my tone flat. The lie felt thin, but I hoped it was enough to make him back off. His next question was worse. Are you getting off at specific stop? It was the stop where I actually needed to transfer trains, but I panicked and lied again. Yes, I said, hoping to throw him off. He smiled, typing back quickly. I'll get off there with you. No, I said firmly, ending the conversation. I put my headphones back in, turning my body even further away from him. For a few blessed minutes, he left me alone. Then he got a phone call. He spoke in French, his voice low but audible. Yeah, I'll get off at that stop. You go to the next one. My chest tightened. The stop he mentioned was the exact one I planned to transfer at. My mind raced, alarm bells ringing. He knew where I was going, and now he wasn't alone. When the train reached the transfer station, John got up and stood by the doors waiting. I forced myself to move slowly, pretending to gather my things as if I had all the time in the world. It was deliberate, painfully obvious, but I didn't care. I needed him to leave first. Finally, he stepped off, glancing back at me once before heading toward another train. I stayed put, counting the seconds until the last possible moment, then stepped off the train and on to the next one, making sure to board at the very front. My eyes scanned everyone around me, searching for any sign of him or anyone acting suspicious. The train pulled away, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. Then my phone buzzed faintly in my bag. I glanced at it quickly. It was a text from my roommate back at the hostel. John saw the brief movement and locked eyes with me. I froze. He grinned, a slow, knowing grin that made my stomach churn. He typed something quickly on his phone and tilted it toward me. The screen read, "You don't look like you're with family." I felt my heart race as I ignored him, staring straight ahead. He chuckled softly to himself and stood up, moving to a seat closer to me. "You should really be careful," he said, breaking his silence in halting English. "Traveling alone can be dangerous." "I'm not alone," I replied, my voice stronger than I felt. "My brother is meeting me at the next stop." His grin didn't waver. "Oh? I hope he is big and strong." The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and I grabbed my bag, moving quickly. He stood too, following at a slower pace. My breath quickened as I stepped onto the platform, my eyes darting around for an exit. The crowd was sparse, and there was no sign of anyone who looked like they could help. Then I saw him again. John stood with a group of 4 other men near the exit, their eyes scanning the platform. My heart sank. He had planned this. I turned sharply, heading in the opposite direction. Pulling my hair out of its bun, I tried to change my appearance as much as possible, ducking into the flow of people and slipping out a side exit. Once outside, I broke into a run, not stopping until I reached the safety of my hostel. I locked myself in my room, my chest heaving. My roommate looked up from her book, startled. "What happened?" she asked. "Just don't let me go anywhere alone again," I said, sinking onto the bed. The encounter left a chill that lingered for the rest of my trip, a stark reminder of how quickly things can take a dangerous turn. Story 4. Last summer, my boyfriend and I decided to escape the chaos of city life and camp on a secluded beach along the Pacific Northwest coast. We brought our dog, a loyal and curious companion, and set up camp near a cluster of weeping willow trees. The beach was beautiful but isolated, with a sheer drop above us where train tracks ran parallel to the coastline, about 40 or 50 feet overhead. The night was calm, the rhythmic crash of waves lulling us into a sense of peace. We built a fire, its crackling warmth warding off the chill of the ocean breeze. Above us, we occasionally heard the rumble of trains passing, their vibrations faintly shaking the ground beneath us. The screech of wheels and the distant whistle were constants, blending into the ambiance of the night. Every hour or so, another train would come and go, a mechanical rhythm in harmony with nature's. Around 2 a.m., the fire had burned down to glowing embers. My boyfriend was sitting quietly, tossing small twigs into the flames, while I was lying back, staring at the canopy of stars. Our dog was curled up between us, half asleep but twitching her ears with every distant sound. Suddenly, we heard the familiar hum of a train approaching. The noise grew louder, the ground faintly trembling as the massive engine neared. Through the thick blackberry bushes lining the tracks, we could just make out the train's shadowy silhouette. The movement was unmistakable, a powerful engine pulling car after car, its mass undeniable even through the dense foliage. We watched in silence as it passed, each car following the last in a seemingly endless procession. And then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it vanished. The last car passed and the sound of the train stopped entirely. I sat up, blinking in confusion. "That's strange," I murmured, half to myself. "What?" my boyfriend asked, glancing at me. "The train," I said. "I mean, where is it?" He frowned, looking back toward the tracks. "What do you mean it passed?" "Exactly," I replied. "But where did it go? We always hear the trains fade into the distance, following the tracks along the water. This one just stopped." We both turned to look out over the coastline. Normally, after a train passed, we'd see it again a few minutes later as the tracks curved along the water's edge. But this time there was nothing, no sound, no lights, just an unnatural silence that seemed to press down on us. Maybe it slowed down," my boyfriend offered, though his voice was uncertain. I shook my head. "We would still hear it," I insisted. "Even when they slow, the engines don't just go silent." Our dog lifted her head then, ears perked, as if sensing something we couldn't. She let out a low whine, her eyes fixed on the blackberry bushes. My boyfriend stood up, brushing the sand from his hands. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the flashlight. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Just to check," he replied, his tone calm but strained. "It's probably nothing." He walked toward the steep incline leading up to the tracks, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I stayed by the fire, my heart pounding as I watched him disappear into the shadows. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft crackle of the dying fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Finally he returned, his face pale. "There's nothing up there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, nothing?" "No train," he said, sitting down heavily beside me. "No tracks disturbed, no sound, nothing. It's like it never existed." I stared at him, my mind racing. "That's not possible. We saw it. We heard it. It was real." "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But it's gone." The dog let out another low whine, this time followed by a short bark. Her eyes were fixed on the bushes, unblinking. "She sees something," I said, my voice trembling. My boyfriend frowned, following her gaze. "Probably just a raccoon," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. He stood again, gripping the flashlight tighter. "I'm going to look one more time." "Be careful," I said, my unease growing. I watched him disappear into the dark once more, the light bobbing faintly as he climbed the incline. The minutes dragged by, and my anxiety grew with each passing second. Then suddenly, the flashlight beam disappeared. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. I stood, my legs shaky, and grabbed the fire poker as a makeshift weapon. The dog was growling now, low and deep, her hackles raised. "Please answer me," I whispered, inching toward the incline. Finally, I saw the light reappear, unsteady and flickering. My boyfriend stumbled down the slope, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "What did you see?" I asked, my grip tightening on the poker. He shook his head, refusing to meet my eyes. "I don't know. I don't want to know. Let's just go." We packed up in frantic silence, our movements hurried and clumsy. The dog barked once sharply, as if urging us on. By the time we drove away from the beach, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, but the chill in the air lingered. To this day, he refuses to talk about what he saw. And every time I think of that night, I'm haunted by the memory of the train that vanished and the silence that followed, as if the world itself had paused to watch something we were never meant to see. Story 5. It was a cold, damp evening in November when I found myself staying at an old inn in a remote town nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills. I was traveling alone, conducting research for a project on abandoned railways, a passion of mine that had led me to some of the most isolated and eerie corners of the country. This particular town had once been a bustling hub during the height of coal transport, but time and technology had reduced it to a quiet shadow of its former self. The inn was charming in its way, though it bore the unmistakable signs of age. Creaky floorboards, dim lighting, and the faint scent of mildew that seemed to seep from the antique furniture. My room overlooked the remnants of the old train station, a crumbling platform partially hidden by overgrown weeds and the skeletal remains of rusted railcars. Beyond it, A single track stretched into the dense woods, disappearing into the mist. After a hearty dinner in the inn's small dining room, I retired to my room, feeling the weight of the day's travel in my limbs. The window rattled slightly as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of leaves rustling and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. As I prepared for bed, I glanced out at the platform below. A single lantern burned dimly near the station's entrance, casting long, flickering shadows that danced eerily against the misty backdrop. Just as I was about to draw the curtains, a movement caught my eye. A figure, tall and shrouded in a heavy coat, emerged from the shadows and stepped onto the platform. At first, I thought it might be a local or perhaps another guest from the inn, but there was something odd about the way they moved, almost as if they were gliding rather than walking. Their head turned sharply, and for a brief moment, I thought they were looking directly at me. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding. It's just someone out for a late-night walk, I murmured to myself, trying to shake off the unease. But as I peered out again, the figure was gone. I scanned the platform and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of them. The lantern continued to sway gently in the breeze, its light unbroken. I closed the curtains and climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the image of the figure, their unnervingly smooth movements and the way their gaze seemed to pierce through the glass. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a low, resonant sound. It took me a moment to place it. The whistle of a train. Sitting up, I listened intently. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. But that didn't make sense. The station had been abandoned for decades, the tracks left to rust and decay. There hadn't been a working train here in years. Curiosity overrode caution, and I threw on a coat before making my way downstairs. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, and the lobby was bathed in shadows. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped outside, the chill night air biting at my skin. The sound of the train was unmistakable now, growing closer with each passing second. I hurried toward the platform, my breath visible in the cold air. As I reached the edge of the platform, the train appeared. It was a massive, hulking engine, its iron body gleaming unnaturally under the pale moonlight. Car after car followed, each one in pristine condition, their windows glowing faintly. But what struck me most was the absence of sound beyond the rhythmic clatter. No voices, no laughter, no sign of life within the cars. It was as though the train carried only shadows. I stood frozen, unable to look away as the train slowed to a stop in front of me. The doors of one car hissed open, revealing a staircase bathed in a dim, amber glow. A figure stepped out, the same one I'd seen earlier. Up close, their presence was even more unsettling. Their face was obscured by the shadow of their hood, but I could feel their gaze on me, heavy and expectant. "You shouldn't be here," they said, their voice low and resonant, as if it echoed from somewhere deep within the train. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The figure tilted their head slightly, as if amused by my silence. "Once you step on, there's no going back," they continued. "Are you ready to leave it all behind?" I took a shaky step back, feeling the pull of the open door. "Who are you?" I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they turned their heads slightly toward the glowing interior of the train car. "Who I am doesn't matter," they said, their tone even. "What matters is whether you are ready to let go of everything you know. The train doesn't come for just anyone." I felt a chill that went deeper than the cold night air. "What happens if I get on?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure let out a soft chuckle. "You will find what you're searching for, or perhaps what you're running from. The question is whether you're brave enough to face it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt my feet inch forward, almost as if they had a mind of their own. My hand reached out toward the doorframe, the dim amber glow seeming to draw me in. But then I stopped, pulling my hand back as if burned. "No," I said firmly, stepping back. "This isn't right." The figure tilted their head again, this time almost in approval. "Not tonight then," they said softly. "But the train always comes back." They turned and stepped back into the car, the doors closing behind them with a hiss. I watched as the train began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The sound of the wheels faded into the distance, and the platform was silent once more. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing and my mind spinning. When I finally returned to the innkeeper was waiting in the lobby, his expression grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. "You're lucky," he continued. "Not everyone who sees it comes back." The rest of the night passed in a haze. By morning, the events felt like a distant dream. But as I packed my bags to leave, I noticed something on the windowsill of my room. A single train ticket, yellowed with age and bearing the faint imprint of a destination I couldn't read. I left it behind, unwilling to take any part of that night with me. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. But every now and then, when I hear the distant whistle of a train, I can't help but wonder if it's calling me back. Story 6. It was late October 1981, and the Kenworth Valley Railway was cloaked in the kind of biting cold that makes your breath visible even under the dim glow of gas lamps. I had volunteered to work as the crossing keeper at Damon Station that night, a duty I'd taken up out of passion for the old railways, but one that often tested my nerves. Damon Station was lonely enough during the day. At night, it felt like the edge of the world. The station platform was empty, coated in a thin layer of frost that gleamed faintly under the incandescent gas lights. Inside the signal box, the pot-bellied stove glowed red-hot, its warmth doing little to ease the creeping chill that seemed to seep from the shadows outside. I sat on the battered old couch, sipping weak tea and waiting for the last train of the evening to pass through from K. The clock ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than the last. The station house across the platform stood dark and abandoned. It had been empty since Annie left last winter, unable to bear living there after her husband Norman passed. The thought of her loneliness crossed my mind, and I shook it off quickly. My only company now was the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the old building. The train was late. It should have left K 5 minutes ago, yet there was no sign of it. I leaned back, letting my eyes wander to the window. The reflection of the signal box interior stared back at me. The dim glow of the gas lights, the outline of the stove, and my own tired face. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that didn't belong. Behind me in the reflection stood a shadowy figure. My heart skipped. The figure was still, indistinct but unmistakable. It appeared to be wearing a peaked cap, like a railway uniform, though its face was obscured. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door to the signal box was bolted. I checked it myself. Gathering my courage, I spun around. Nothing. The room was empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the stove. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing into the darkness. Silence. Not even the distant hum of the main Halifax road a mile away broke the stillness. The usual rustling of the river nearby had ceased, as if the entire valley was holding its breath. Shivering, I lit a cigarette, the faint orange glow doing little to calm my nerves, and returned to the signal box. Once inside, I bolted the door again and sat down, trying to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, a product of the flickering gas lamps and my own imagination. I forced myself to look back at the window. My reflection was there, but so was the shadowy figure. This time it was clearer. It stood motionless, its form dark and distinct, the outline of a railway uniform unmistakable. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though it were studying me. My breath caught in my throat, and without thinking, I bolted for the door, throwing it open and stepping into the icy night. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Again, silence. The platform stretched out before me, empty except for the faintly glowing gas lamps. I walked its length, the frost crunching underfoot, my breath clouding the air. There was no one. No laughter from local kids playing tricks, no footsteps retreating into the dark. A shrill whistle shattered the stillness, making me jump. The train. Finally. I ran to the crossing gates, adrenaline surging through my veins. The Midland 4F steam locomotive roared into view, its headlamp piercing the gloom. I opened the gates just in time, signaling the train through. The conductor waved as it thundered past, oblivious to the strange events unfolding in this desolate station. I closed the gates behind the train and hurried back to the signal box, determined to finish my duties quickly and leave. As I extinguished the gas lamps and locked up the box, my mind raced. What had I seen? Was it a trick of the light? Or something else entirely? The walk home was uneasy. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the trees a reminder of the figure I'd seen. When I finally reached the warmth of my small cottage, I bolted the door and poured myself a stiff drink, vowing never to work alone at Damon Station again. For weeks, I tried to forget that night, but the memory lingered, resurfacing in quiet moments and vivid dreams. Then one evening, I overheard a group of older railway workers swapping ghost stories. One mentioned Damon Station and the tale of the railway keeper. "They say he was a signalman who died on duty," one of them said, his voice low. "A tragic accident. He's been seen ever since, still watching over the station, making sure the trains run safely." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I never told anyone what I'd seen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadowy figure was more than just a trick of the light. And to this day, whenever I pass Damon Station, I can't help but glance toward the platform, half expecting to see that faceless silhouette standing under the gas lamps, keeping watch. Story 7. It was late autumn in 1981, the kind of damp, cold evening that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. Ted Smith had spent the better part of the day plowing his new field, a long, coveted parcel of land he'd recently acquired. The moonlight filtered through the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the grass. Ted had been dreaming of expanding his small farm for years, and now he finally had the extra acreage. It felt like a victory, until the plow unearthed something unexpected. As the heavy blade bit into the soil, it snagged on something solid. With a frustrated grunt, Ted killed the tractor's engine and climbed down to inspect the obstruction. At first he thought it was a tree root, but as he knelt closer, a glint of bone caught the pale light. Brushing away the dirt, he revealed a skeleton. It was too small to be a cow and too large for a dog, the skull flat and elongated, almost like that of a grotesque, oversized hound. "Wow, what in God's name?" Ted muttered, his breath fogging in the chill night air. Later at home, Ted sat at the kitchen table with his wife, Maureen. The remnants of dinner were pushed to one side, replaced by a hastily drawn map of the field. The unearthed skull sat between them, its hollow eyes staring blankly into the room. "It's old, Maureen said, poking at the bones with a wooden spoon. "Probably nothing more than a hunting dog buried by the previous owners." "Doesn't feel right," Ted replied. "The way it was buried, and the size of it, it's not natural." Maureen's lips pressed into a thin line. "If you've any sense, you'll leave it be. Let the dead rest, Ted." Ted sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You think it could be worth something if it's ancient or tied to history. Worth trouble, more likely," Maureen said, standing to clear the dishes. "You always have to poke the bear, don't you?" But Ted wasn't one to leave well enough alone. The next morning he invited his friend Jim, the local railway signalman, to take a look. Jim was a man with a taste for mystery and had a knack for solving puzzles. "A fine mess you found yourself in, Ted," Jim said with a chuckle as he examined the field. The two men stood over the half-exposed skeleton, the morning sun doing little to dispel the chill in the air. "What do you make of it?" Ted asked. Jim crouched down, tilting his head. "Well, it's no regular dog, that's for sure. Why don't we take the skull to Dave? The vet, he'll know more." Later that day, Jim brought the skull to Dave, who frowned as he turned it over in his hands. "It's old," he said, his voice cautious. "Could be a dog, but it's unlike any breed I've ever seen. The size alone is unusual." "Where did you find it?" Jim hesitated. "Out on Ted's new field. Should we put it back?" Dave shrugged. "Might be best. No sense stirring up trouble over old bones." That evening, Ted and Jim sat in the local pub, the skull wrapped carefully in a bag at Jim's feet. The fire crackled nearby, but neither man felt its warmth. "It's just a coincidence, Jim," Ted said after a long silence. "Bones buried in a field. It's not like they're cursed." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Maybe, but that thing doesn't sit right with me. Did you see the teeth?" "What kind of dog has jaws like that?" Ted chuckled nervously. "A hungry one, or maybe just an old breed, something long extinct." Jim shook his head. "Extinct or not, I don't like it. You should have left it in the ground." The nights that followed were restless. Ted and Jim both reported hearing strange sounds. Low growls, scratching at doors, and on more than one occasion, a blood-curdling howl that seemed to echo from everywhere, and nowhere at once. Ted's dog refused to enter the field, its hackles raised and a low whine escaping its throat whenever it was near. One stormy night, Jim's fears reached their peak. Alone in the signal box, he heard the now familiar growl outside. Gathering his courage, he opened the door, lantern in hand. The dog stood there again, its eyes burning like coals. This time it didn't vanish. It stepped forward, its lips curling into a snarl. Jim slammed the door and locked it, but the scratching continued, relentless and maddening. The next morning, the villagers found Jim's signal box empty. The door was ajar, and deep claw marks scored the wooden frame. Jim was never seen again, and the skull's whereabouts remain a mystery. Ted eventually sold his farm and moved away, but the locals say the black dog still roams the field. On moonless nights, you can hear its howls, and if you're unlucky, you might catch a glimpse of its glowing eyes watching from the shadows. To this day, the field remains untouched, a chilling reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. Story 8. It was the summer of our European adventure, and my best friend Clara and I, both 22, had spent months backpacking across the continent. Our days had been filled with breathtaking sights, chaotic train stations, and stories to last a lifetime. But nothing prepared us for what happened in that desolate Turkish train station. We had left our hostel early, determined to catch the night train that would take us to Budapest. It was a remote station, surrounded by little more than barren highways and a gas station that seemed perpetually closed. With 5 hours to kill before departure, we settled on a worn metal bench near the entrance, our backpacks resting at our feet. The station was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're intruding on something unseen. The occasional rumble of trains echoed faintly, a reminder of the world beyond the shadows. About an hour into our wait, a uniformed officer approached. His presence was abrupt, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he asked in heavily accented English, his voice low and clipped. I straightened, trying to keep my tone polite. "We're waiting for the night train to Budapest." His eyes narrowed. "Tickets." I fumbled with my bag, pulling out our Eurail passes. Clara stayed quiet, her unease palpable. The officer examined the passes for a long moment before shaking his head. "These are not enough. You need tickets." "But," I began, only to be cut off. "Follow me." We exchanged nervous glances but obeyed. He led us to a dimly lit ticket counter, where the clerk barely glanced up as he barked something in Turkish. After an exchange we couldn't understand, the clerk handed us small slips of paper, seat assignments it seemed. Satisfied, the officer turned to us. "You must wait in a safer place. Come." He escorted us to a small, windowless room at the end of a corridor. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead and the air felt stale. "Stay here until your train arrives," he instructed before leaving. His footsteps echoed down the hall, fading into the distance. Clara exhaled sharply. "What was that about?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just stay put." We distracted ourselves with a movie on my laptop, trying to ignore the unsettling vibe of the room. But about an hour later, the officer returned, his demeanor strangely insistent. "You must move again," he said, gesturing for us to follow. This pattern repeated. Each time he would ask the same questions. "Why are you here? Where are you going? How long have you been traveling?" His tone wasn't hostile, but there was something unnervingly persistent about him. By the third time, Clara and I were too rattled to do more than comply. Finally, it was time to board. We grabbed our bags and headed toward the terminal. As we approached the escalator, the officer appeared again, stepping out of the shadows. His hand clamped down on my arm, the grip firm and cold. "Go ahead," he told Clara, motioning toward the escalator. She hesitated, her eyes darting between us. "I'll wait." "Go," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Reluctantly, she stepped onto the escalator, her worried gaze fixed on me as she ascended. The officer waited until she was out of earshot before leaning in close. His breath was warm against my cheek. "Are you on Instagram?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The question blindsided me. My mind raced, but all I could think about was getting out of his grasp. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking. "Type it in," he demanded, handing me his phone. I did as he asked, my fingers trembling. As soon as I finished, he released my arm and stepped back, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Have a good trip," he said, his tone suddenly light. I bolted up the escalator, my heart pounding. Clara was waiting at the top, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked. "Just go," I said, my voice breaking. We found our seats on the train and locked ourselves in the compartment. My hands shook as I blocked him on Instagram, his unread message staring back at me. Do you remember me? The train began to move, the station falling away into the night. I let out a shuddering breath, trying to convince myself it was over. But Clara's expression stopped me short. Did you see him? She whispered. Who? Outside on the platform. He was just standing there watching us. I turned to the window, but the station was already a blur in the distance. My chest tightened. It's just your imagination, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The train sped on through the night, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks offering little comfort. Hours passed, but neither of us could sleep. When we finally reached Budapest, the relief was palpable. Yet as we stepped off the train, something felt wrong. A figure stood near the edge of the platform, partially obscured by shadow. For a moment, I thought it was him, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. Clara grabbed my arm, her grip almost painful. Let's just get out of here, she said. We left the station, our backpacks heavy on our shoulders. But even as we walked into the bright, bustling streets of Budapest, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching.